Welcome to Los Altos Institution Speaker Series. Our guest today is Aparna Pande, a research fellow at the Hudson Institute specializing in South Asia, especially India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, with a focus on foreign policy and security. She earned a Master's of Philosophy in International Relations from Jawaharlal Nehru Institute University and a PhD in Political Science from Boston University in 2010. She frequently writes for major outlets in the United States and India. Her books include Explaining Pakistan's Foreign Policy in 2011, From Chanakya to Modi in 2017, The Rutledge Handbook of Contemporary Pakistan in 2017, and Making India Great in 2020. Thank you for joining us. I think with that, we'll start with our first question. What exactly has changed under Trump's second term, which has led to a sharp decline in the US-India relations? I think everything seemed good until Prime Minister Modi visited in February, but now we have political figures like Scott Bessent and Peter Navarro who are taking shots at India while India is mingling with China.
Morning, Ethan. Thanks for inviting me. So it's true, at the start of the second Trump administration, India was in a strong position. The Indian Prime Minister was the fourth world leader to meet President Trump. They were and still have a good personal relationship. India supposed to had a great, an early start in trade negotiations. The two countries were aligned on China, and India's Russia relationship was on the back burner, and US relations with Pakistan were not that strong. Come October of 2025, things look very different. India still has the highest tariffs imposed on any American partner. US-Pakistan relations are stronger today than they were in the last few years. And India's relations with Russia, which were always a minor irritant, have become a central issue and are being used to push India. And as of now, we don't really know where the Indo-Pacific strategy, Quad, and American involvement in the world are going to be. And so, where do we stand in October 2025? Your question implies that all was well before January 2025. And I have a slightly different view. Things didn't change simply because of trade issues. And Russia is not the only reason, or Pakistan, that we are where we are today. The two countries have always had inbuilt stress points in every aspect of their relationship. They're different histories, different geographies. One is a 5,000-year-old civilization, which is also a state. And the other is a 250-year-old country, which has a remarkable geography, which many countries would love to have. And so they do have divergent interests, even if they have shared values. And the policies of the previous 5 successive American presidential administrations were driven by a strategic assumption that the rise of India is in American national interests. India was seen as a fellow democracy, a country with which the US shared values, and also shared interests because China, American grand strategy since the end of the Second World War has always been that it will never allow a peer competitor to rise. And so the rise of China over the last 2 decades or 3 decades has meant that the US has built a network of alliances and partners to push back against the rise of China. And India was seen as the counterweight to China because of its size, population, economy, and military. But there was an expectation that, India would fulfill certain, economic and military expectations that the United States had. India, however, saw this 35-year trajectory as continuing as it is without any change in it. And I think, in later questions, we can discuss why, why these stress points, what these stress points are, and why they have come to the fore. But the final point, India's foreign policy since 1947 has been based on the fact that the country looks for a multipolar world, because that's the only world in which India can play a role. It is not large enough to be one of the two poles or the only pole in the world. And so India's default, whenever there's a problem, sort of, crisis, challenge, is to go back to what is called strategic autonomy or multi-alignment. And so you talked about India hobnobbing with China. It's not hobnobbing with China. China is the world's largest trading partner of every country. It is the second largest economy, may even be the largest economy today. It is India's neighbor. And so India does have a relationship with China. It will have to have a relationship with China.
Yeah.
But at a time when India is concerned about whether or not the US is going to be involved in the world and engaged with the world, India will sort of have a relationship with China, Russia, Japan, Europe, and the United States, and countries of the global south. So India is simply ensuring that it it keeps India needs to keep its national interests in mind. And so it's defaulting to a multi-alignment strategy because it isn't very confident that the US is going to remain engaged with the world, at least for a few years right now.
And thank you for the answer. I think we haven't really, I mean, I hadn't really explored the fact that the US and India had such major differences, although they have been in an alliance for quite some time. In a recent article, I think you talked about like the lack of institutional framework in the Indo-US relationship. But the reality is that the U.S. true diplomatic strategic alliances have been through defense pacts. And do you think India not having a defense pact with the United States will limit this Indo-US relationship?
Yes and no. So let's be clear. You said the two countries are in alliance. They are not. Ally means a security ally. India has never signed a security pact, with one exception in 1970 with Soviet Union, just around the time of the 1971 war. But then that didn't continue. But India doesn't sign security alliances. So India is a partner. It is a BFF, but it is never going to be a security ally of the United States. So yes, not being a security ally does cause inherent limitations, because the way the American security and foreign policy is structured, if you're a security ally, you get access to military equipment, you get access to training, all of that. And access to certain technologies with the United States does not sell to anyone except its close security partners. Now, India is a major defense partner. That categorization was, I think, 2018. And so India has also been added to the list of countries which have access to, high-end American equipment, the crown jewels. So in that sense, the US has made exceptions for India in recent years. But when I talk about institutional framework, I'm not necessarily talking about a defense pact. One, because India hasn't asked for one, and two, let's be frank, the US hasn't offered one. So, you can say a defense pact, but one side has to offer it as well, right?
Yeah.
And the US isn't really offering defense pacts to new countries. But what I mean actually is, a deepening of the relationship across the spectrum in the key areas. I mean, there are three pegs of the relationship. There's an economic, commercial, bilateral trade relationship. There's a security and strategic partnership. And then there's a people-to-people relationship. So if you look at, the the people-to-people or the values-based partnership, that has had, that historically was the reason this relationship survived during the Cold War, because there was no economic relationship at that time, and there was no security relationship during the Cold War. But that values-based relationship, that has faced, let's say, pressures in the last decade or so, because of views within American liberals and certain segments of US society, that India is no longer, as democratic and open and plural as it used to be. And so there's concerns about democratic backsliding, human rights, religious freedom, both on the American left and the American right. So sort of, the way to, so there are these stress points which are coming out, and India has been unable to sort of, ensure that these stress points do not impact the values-based part of the partnership. Similarly, on the economic side, 35 years after India's economy opened up, yes, they are American companies. Yes, trade is almost 200 billion. But talk of making it 500 billion goes back to the Obama administration. So we are almost, let's say a decade and a half since the Obama administration. It's still not hit 500. And there's a reason for that. India is protectionist. There are market access challenges. There are tariff and trade. All of these go back. And so, part of the reason for the strong relationship between the United States and the North Atlantic countries is not just NATO. It has to do the very strong economic partnership that American companies make money there. They have investment there. They will never allow that relationship with that country to sink below a certain level. And that creates, groups within American society who will champion and push for that relationship. That the economic part, India was never able to build. So you don't have those constituencies within American society who will push for the relationship and never allow it to fall below a certain level. And of course, on the security front, India doesn't purchase as much American defense equipment as American partners, allies do. And so even within that American defense military security establishment, India is seen as important because of what India is, not because those sinews of support have been built within that system. That is what I mean by an institutional framework. There have to be people who sort of, who are interested in and champion the relationship, aside from just a few people within each administration.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. I think touching both on economic and defense, I think that we really understand how the U.S.-India relationship has not really been to its fullest. I think you talked about trade and tariffs. That's leading right into my next question. There's been a lot of action since President Trump took office. According to you, what is preventing a U.S.-India trade deal? I mean, there's been some speculation that it's because India purchases a lot of Russian oil. Are these just excuses, and what are the real issues here?
So going back to the first Trump administration, there has been talk about a trade deal, right? At that time, there was talk of a mini trade deal between US, India, wasn't signed, didn't happen. And so sort of, I think as the Trump administration came in, the Indian side, the two sides had conversations, and apparently there is a trade deal on the table. India has apparently given a lot, offered a lot, basically zero tariffs in most areas, which would give the US a lot more sort of, in this trade deal than in any trade negotiations in the last 35 years between US and India. But sort of at the end of the day, the challenge is that, sort of we live in a sort of the current administration's view of trade is that trade deal has to be the best and it has to look and sound the best. Sort of, in other trade deals, there have been talks of like Japan offering 500 billion in investment, or Korea offering something else, or, sort of, and those are the kinds of, there has to be something spectacular which has to be offered for the trade deal to be seen as being, acceptable. And India has challenges in one part of the US-India trade negotiations, which would be the agriculture and dairy side, where it is tougher for a country which has about at least a quarter of its population under poverty, and where agriculture employs a very large segment of Indian society. And that in November of this year, a North Indian state of Bihar is going for elections. And so a combination of domestic politics, agrarian interests, and the fact that there's nothing as spectacular in this deal as, for example, in the Europe deal or Japan or South Korea. The Russian oil factor doesn't necessarily have to do with the trade deal, even though it may help with the trade deal. This has more to do with the desire to end the Ukraine conflict and so to apply pressure on Russia. And since pressure on China, which is the largest purchaser of Russian oil, wasn't possible, pressure on India has been placed. But for the trade deal to happen is easy. The extra 25% tariffs on India can be lifted. India can offer to buy less Russian oil. And India can do that because historically, the oil India purchased pre-2022, Russian oil formed less than 1% of the oil India purchased. Most of India's oil has been from the Middle East and not from Russia. Because Russian oil is cheap, India has been purchasing that, but India has used very little of it. India normally, Indian companies buy it and then sell it off to Europe and other parts of the world. So India can reduce the amount of Russian oil it is purchasing and buy from some other country. It'll have to pay more for it because Russian oil is very cheap, but it can do that if that is one of the conditions, one of the quid pro quos you give in exchange for signing a trade deal, less Russian oil, offer a little on agriculture and dairy. But I don't believe it is trade related issues which are stopping the trade deal. It has to do with geopolitics. It has to do with how this administration views the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Middle East, all of those issues. So it can be resolved tomorrow, and there can be a trade deal, or it can take a few months, and hopefully not a few years. But it can be signed any day. I mean, it's literally there. It just needs political will, and whether that means a conversation between the two leaders or a meeting between the two leaders or something between high-level officials, we'll have to wait and see.
I think just tying into my last question, do you believe that there's a chance for US and India to resolve their differences and come to an agreement on a trade deal?
Yes, I do believe because basically, as the Indian negotiator have said, 90% of the trade deal, and everything India had to offer is already on the table. It requires a political will. So if the president believes the trade deal looks good, and the US side is willing to lift that extra 25% tariffs which were imposed on August 1st, and if India also says, okay, we will buy less Russian oil, and maybe offer a little more on the agriculture and dairy side, opening up the Indian agriculture will be good for India. I mean, opening up India's economy, making market access easier will help India's economy in the long run. So it can be done. So as I said, it can happen tomorrow, it can happen in a week, it can happen at the end of the month. I believe the ASEAN summit is in end of October in Kuala Lumpur. And as of now, both the president and prime minister are supposed to go there. The new US ambassador to India has also been confirmed, and he is currently in India right now. I think he met the prime minister this morning. So there are these positive signals. So if the ambassador has taken, something with him on his visit, saying that, the trade deal can be done with this, then it's possible. I will caution, however, that while the trade deal can be signed and India can reduce the import of oil, and at the public symbolic level, things will look better. Public opinion in India has been hurt. And so the view of India is one of those few countries in the world which is not an American security ally, where historically the US has rated like 75% in public opinion polling. That has been damaged. And changing that will take a lot longer.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very optimistic in terms of the US India trade deal happening, and completely agree with your point that the perception of US and India has gone down massively ever since these trade negotiations have fallen through. For years, the US has seen India as a tactical long-term counterweight to China. Has this concept been downgraded, or is it merely a tactical goal? And what milestones would you look at to see this renewed seriousness on this front?
So I think all of us who follow foreign policy, grand strategy, are actually waiting to see what the US national defense strategy paper says. Is there going to be a national security strategy as is released by every incoming administration? Because that will give us an idea of what this administration plans to do. Now, historically, as I mentioned earlier, um, since the end of the Cold War, the US grand strategy has been it will never allow a peer competitor to rise. To Soviet Union, then Russia, and now it's China. Now, China was and will remain a peer competitor and rival to the United States, even if there's a trade deal which is signed by the current administration, and even if the, even if the current administration does not focus as much on the Indo-Pacific, on China, and is focused more on the Western Hemisphere, Europe, Middle East, the Americas, the threat from China will not disappear anywhere. China will remain the pacing threat, as it's called, and it will still remain the primary focus of American military strategy, its resource allocation. That will not change. Though, if there's less attention to China in this administration, one may have to wait it out to the next administration to see, how the US works with its partners and allies. So we do have to wait and see what the national defense or the national security strategy says. However, the question would, I'd like to throw the question back at you and, in a rhetorical sense and ask you, the US may view India as a counterweight to China. Does India view itself as the counterweight to China? And if it does, then India would need to have built its economy. And yes, India is the fourth largest economy per GDP, but not GDP per capita, right? The last time that India grew at 8 to 10% was in the 2010s, 2010, 11, 12, 13. After that, India has not crossed 6.5%. And while 6.5% is very good, it is the fastest growing emerging economy, it is still not sufficient for India for its own domestic, forget about its foreign and military. Second, it needs to do a lot to build its own economy, to be the alternate to China, market access, manufacturing, skilling its labor force. It has a demographic potential for 3 decades. It needs to prevent it from becoming a demographic disaster and therefore be a counterweight to China. And the military side, India hasn't really modernized its military. The last 2 clashes with Pakistan show that Pakistan has newer equipment, even if it is Chinese, not necessarily American. And it can, at least for a few day limited conflict, it can stand up to India or not lose to India, which is all that's required by a smaller country. So India needs to, and India also needs to India has found it difficult to maintain its primacy in its own neighborhood, where China is in every neighbor of India's. So if you want to be the counterweight that others want you to be, you do need to build your hard power. And so while the US may or may not see India over the next few years as the counterweight, for India's own interests, India needs to build up its hard power so that others see it as the counterweight to China or the alternative to China.
Yeah, I think that was a very interesting point. I think India does need to build up its economy to be even 60%, 70% of China, because they have such a majority in trade and dominance. So, my next question was the Quad was a very hyped up concept, this coalition between India, US, Japan, and Australia. Has that basically died after US India relations have declined over the past few months?
Actually, the minilateral conversations between the two countries are doing better than the bilateral. So, in that sense, the symbolic level, the Quad has retained significance. The very first foreign policy engagement of Secretary of State Rubio in January of this year was the Quad foreign ministers meeting. The second one took place in July. And as of now, the leaders level summit is still supposed to happen. It may not happen this year, may happen early next year, but as of now, it's still supposed to happen. But the Quad's challenge, at some level, its challenge or its dilemma are tied to its very foundation. It was a partnership of four democracies that are the world's leading economies, and they have considerable military power. But it was conceived as a deterrent to China, not just symbolically, but substantively. To do that, Quad has to, just as India has to be India to be the alternative to China, India has to build itself, build its hard power to be the alternative or the minilateral in the Indo-Pacific. Quad has to be able to offer alternatives to China's BRI, right? The Belt and Road Initiative. So, infrastructure, capacity building, sort of at some level, the Quad has done it through humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, maritime security, Indo-Pacific, maritime domain awareness. It has also done some on the tech front by bringing the four countries together. But these four countries are trading partners, but have yet, they conduct military exercises. They have similar security concerns, but they have yet to build Quad's hard power. Quad has historically focused on public goods because it's easier to work on humanitarian assistance and capacity building than to work on, economic investment, security. The Quad has so the four Quad countries have a military exercise called Malabar, which is in November of this year. But it's not Quad, right? It's called Malabar. So there are, yes, there's maritime security, but there needs to be naval, naval linkages. The four countries need to have interoperability in their military. They need to have closer economic ties. That hard power component hasn't happened. And so as of now, I don't believe China sees Quad as a threat. When Quad first sort of was rejuvenated in 2017, the Chinese Foreign Ministry referred to Quad as sea foam, that it'll dissipate after some time. Now it's not dissipated, but in order to survive, it'll need, economic and military muscle to back it. Let's see if that happens over the next few years, or if it goes back to being what it was about a decade ago, which is, another minilateral talk shop where countries work together on public goods, but don't really go beyond that.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I think you acknowledged a very important point about Quad having no such real impact to China right now, and they don't see it as a threat. Moving on to my last question, I think just recently H-1B visas have been in the news because of their new $100,000 filing fee. Also, the new proposed Hire Act is seen as a particularly targeting the Indian IT operations. Do you think this is more of a function of like the soft hiring environment and the current administration and will go away once it gets better? Or do you see this as a shift in US government approach towards skilled immigration in general?
So I see this as long term, short answer. Immigration, skilled and unskilled, attracting talent globally, building a society and economy upon all of this was based upon a world that looked favorably at globalization and mobility. That was the 1990s. Today, we are living in a world where protectionism, nationalism, populism are growing, and where there is a rising anti-immigrant sentiment in almost every country. I don't think that there's an exception anywhere in the world. So the changes that are happening are going to have long-term consequences because they reflect a societal shift. And so it'd be difficult to reverse in its entirety. So yes, there were certain actions that the first Trump administration took on, even that time on work visas, H-1B and others, or permanent residency, which the Biden administration gave reprieve for, but sort of, whatever happened, but just as at some level, the America First policy of Trump 1.0 was continued under Biden. A certain amount of protectionism, certain amount of building at home, build back better, build at home. Similarly, the big picture immigration changes which are happening right now at some level will be difficult to reverse. They'll also have longer term consequences beyond just H-1B and the United States, yes, it's an immigrant country, but there's a deeper issue here that for the last 3.5, 4 decades more, the US has welcomed talent from around the world. That is what has built the American entrepreneurship, American society, American academia, American, sort of, and that has attracted talent from everywhere, primarily as students, and then also as entrepreneurs. If people start to go to other countries as they are, one of the ramifications of the H-1B or student visas was that Canada offered sort of anyone who had an offer of a student visa to the United States but could not come this semester to come there. Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, there are countries around the world which are going to take that talent because they know talent is important. So it may not have an impact in the next year or two. It will have an impact in a decade. That talent will go elsewhere. If fewer students come here, if fewer people who are highly skilled stay here, if companies, in order to keep talent, sort of decide to move their offices or their back offices or their R&D to Mexico, Canada, Europe, UK, then changes take place, right? In a decade or so, it will have a long-lasting impact, and that will be difficult to reverse. Just as, the example I'll give of India and then I'll stop. Till the 1990s, most Indians went to UK to study. They did not come to the United States because the 1960s immigration from India was doctors and engineers who'd already got their degrees in India and they moved here after the Lyndon Johnson changes into immigration. The 1990s, people came to study here. So it's 3.5 decades of that. If that reverses and they start going to Australia, Singapore, the Middle East, that will have, that will have long-term repercussions, which will be difficult to reverse. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. I think with this, the main section is over. All your answers have been super informative for our audience. I think we have time for maybe one question from LAI fellows. If you could unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask a question, that would be great.
So I have a question. I'm Kayvon. I'm the president of LAI, and I noted when you were speaking that one of the major stress points you identified was that Americans are seeing India trend less democratic. Do you think that this trend will continue in that direction just based off of the current political status, like over the next, say, 20 years? And how do you think like that might affect American support of India?
So at the end of the day, the path that India takes in the next decade or two, I don't think I have a crystal ball which will tell me that. But sort of, there's always been a struggle within Indian society or Indian civilization between the two ideas of India. And so the more modern Indian state for the last 78 years has struggled between two ideas, an idea of a more inclusive civilizational tent type India, which was the view of India's founding father, Mahatma Gandhi, and the first prime minister, that it doesn't matter, sort of what your religion or where your ancestors came from. If you're born in India, you are Indian. And the second was a more, sort of exclusive idea of India, which is that India, was a Hindu civilization. Hindus are the majority, and therefore India is a Hindu majority state, a country, and the state should reflect that. And that minorities of any kind or any size should accept the fact that it's a Hindu majority society and civilization. There's always been that that clash, sort of, but it has come more to the fore in the last, I would say, 4 decades, but closer in the last decade plus. But it's not as though anything that is happening in the last decade didn't happen earlier. Right? I mean, so, sort of relations between the majority and the largest minority, which in some ways is very difficult to call a minority. 14% of 1.4 billion is a very large number. It's 150 million people. So 200 million, you can't call them a minority, has always been tense. Unfortunately, sort of, we live in a world of populism and populist politics, which means that that political parties have a tendency to play to the lowest common denominator, which is identity politics. So rather than saying that vote me in and I'm going to build hospitals and schools and give you jobs, it is, you do realize the reason your son doesn't have admission is because that other person has got admission through affirmative action. And that plays better. So Indians sort of, I don't sort of, barring something changing in Indian domestic politics, that the average Indian demands that their politician sort of improve healthcare, education, manufacturing, and give them jobs. I do believe at some level identity politics will continue to play a role, which will mean that we will see continued trend line of, sort of identity politics, religious freedom under attack, human rights. But I mean, sort of, I do think that with 1.4 billion people and a parliamentary system, it is very difficult to really suppress sort of, voters or even any, sort of religious group. I mean, Muslims have voted in India from 1947 onwards. They are political parties. They're even in the BJP. They're in every political party, and they're in every aspect of society. So in that sense, yes, there will be challenges, but I do believe that in the long run, a society which is so diverse will find its equilibrium. Now, will it have an impact on US-India relations? Absolutely. Part of it has to do with the fact that there are 4.5 million Indian Americans, and I'm talking of, these are people who were born and brought up in this country, not those who are students, those who are on work visas, those who are green cards, or who have recently got citizenship. And a diaspora carries itself, right? So it carries its culture. So there are Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Sikhs within the Indian American diaspora. And what happens at home will have an impact on your relationship with other members of your diaspora and what you ask your representatives to do vis-a-vis India, right? Diaspora politics plays into American politics as well. And so, yes, it will have an impact. I do think that the values-based relationship will still is still the strongest binding force between US and India. Because if we look today, people who are speaking up about the US-India relationship are on the left of the spectrum. The Democrats are speaking out. Republicans are not. Now, it could be various reasons, but at the end of the day, the values-based relationship and partnership is important enough for people to speak out. But let's not forget, the US has its own churning right now, right? And so American churning, American populism, views on immigration will have an equal impact on the US-India relationship. And how Indians see, is the US moving away from the world? Is the US turning inwards? And is US domestic politics and the US churn making it less likely that an Indian will be able to move to the country, study, and work? So it works both ways. Domestic politics impacts foreign policy in each country, and it will work in different ways. It's not going to be positive necessarily. It will pull you apart rather than bring you closer.
Thank you. I mean, I think that was a really good in-depth answer. I think the nuance of it definitely has helped me understand. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think with that, we'll end it. Thank you so much for your time, Ms. Pande, and we hope the audience has learned something and it gained insights to all your talking points about US-India relations. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.